The Federal Reserve just embarked on a rate policy experiment that is by far one of the most controversial moves in decades. It cut interest rates while inflation was still above the target 2%. Historically, central bankers avoid easing policy until price growth is fully tamed. Yet, with economic growth faltering and job losses seeming to be more and more prevalent, the Fed decided to nudge its benchmark rate down to about 4.1% from a peak that was well above 5%, despite inflation hovering near 3% instead of the target 2%. The Fed says it's trying to save jobs and prevent a recession. This unusual situation, easing monetary policy with inflation still somewhat elevated, has prompted some to dub it the scariest rate experiment in modern Fed history. Critics are warning that this gamble could reignite inflation, just like it did in the 1970s. Policymakers are effectively testing whether they can support a cooling economy without reigniting inflation, walking a tightrope between their twin mandates of price stability and employment. So, why would the world's most powerful central bank take this risk now? The answer isn't just about economics. It's about politics, debt, and a bet that could either cement the Fed's credibility or trigger a financial storm that forces them into even harsher measures later. Okay, so let's start by taking a look at this data real quick. It's from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Federal Reserve, and it was compiled by Reuters. It shows US inflation, consumer prices, remaining above the Fed's 2% goal, even as the Fed has begun trimming its policy rate. This divergence underscores why observers call the Fed's 2025 rate cuts a risky experiment. Multiple forces converged this year to push the Fed toward rate cuts even with inflation above target. First, the economy's momentum downshifted. Now, one can argue that this is from tariffs or lack of certainty in the markets, but it's very clear that there is a downshift happening. After a post-pandemic boom, job growth slowed to a crawl. The US added just 22,000 jobs in August and even lost jobs in June, a stark change from robust gains of prior years. The unemployment rate ticked up to 4.3% by late summer, and leading indicators, like rising jobless claims, pointed to a cooling labor market. Fed Chair Jerome Powell noted that recent monthly hiring is likely below the break-even pace needed to keep unemployment stable, warning that any uptick in layoffs could swiftly raise joblessness. In other words, the risk of a job market slide, even outright stagnation, was growing. This raised alarms inside the Fed that sticking with very high rates might overshoot and needlessly wreck the employment side of their mandate. At the same time, political and fiscal dynamics in 2025 have changed. They've created strong incentives for lower interest rates. The new administration, it took office and immediately pursued expansionary policies. In July, Congress passed the ambitiously named One Big Beautiful Bill Act, a sweeping law that made 2017 tax cuts permanent and added new tax breaks. This 887-page legislation provided generous tax reductions, from lower income tax brackets to higher deductions and credits, injecting stimulus into the economy and ballooning the federal deficit in future years. The government also enacted large tariffs on imports in 2025. We all know about this. And this is part of a trade agenda meant to pressure other countries and boost domestic industry. In theory, it should increase the amount of jobs, not reduce it, but that doesn't seem to be what's happening. These import taxes drove up costs for many goods, adding to inflation in the short run. Yet, despite introducing their own inflationary pressure, the administration openly pushed the Fed to cut rates to juice the economy. By September, the White House had mounted an intense pressure campaign, urging the Fed to lower borrowing costs to stimulate growth and reduce interest payments. And the irony here is that they were urging the Fed to do this to make up for all the issues that they had in fact created. President Trump himself demanded steep rate cuts, even suggesting a 1% Fed policy rate, which would have been absolutely insane. It would have been unprecedentedly low. Well, the whole idea here was to reduce the federal government's debt burden. It would have had a pretty significant impact on consumers with respect to inflation. He also took extraordinary steps to sway Fed leadership, installing a political ally, Governor Stephen Miron, who just recently has been ruled out as the next Fed governor. That's a whole different story. He added Miron to the board right before a key meeting, and even attempted, unsuccessfully, to fire another Fed governor who wasn't aligned with his views. In summary, By late 2025, the Fed faced a confluence of pressure from both inside and outside. A weakening economy raising recession fears, a government running big deficits after tax cuts, and thus favoring cheap credit. And of course, then there was direct political pressure from the president. This backdrop set the stage for the Fed's controversial choice to resume rate cuts. As one Fed official put it, the U.S. economy was at a key moment, a turning point, with both sides of the Fed's dual mandate under strain. Inflation was still above target, and even rising again a bit due to tariffs. But employment was now clearly deteriorating. The Fed's calculus became which risk is more pressing, running too hot on inflation or letting the job market crumble. Powell explained that when both inflation and employment deviate from goals, the Fed will focus on whichever problem is further away from target. In late 2025, that appeared to be the job market. This shifting balance of risk is explicitly why the Fed decided to lower rates by 0.25% in September, breaking its long pause on easing. Not everyone agrees that cutting rates in 2025 is the right move. Economists and even some Fed officials have voiced sharp concerns that this policy shift might be premature, and it may risk a resurgence of inflation. Their main argument was that inflation was not yet down to 2%, so easing up now could undo the hard-won progress of the last several years. Indeed, by the Fed's own preferred index, prices were climbing 2.7 to 2.9% year over year in the late summer. And they were even higher than that earlier in the year, after dipping briefly in the spring to 2.2%. Inflation has unarguably drifted back up as tariffs drive up prices. Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee, he cautioned it's unclear if the tariff-driven price hikes will be a one-off blip or a more persistent problem that could lead to stagflation. That's when there is stagnant growth and high inflation. In other words, there's a real fear that loosening policy now, with inflation still around 3%, could entrench an elevated inflation rate rather than letting it glide back to 2%. Historical echoes amplify these worries. In the 1970s, otherwise known as the stop-go era, the Fed repeatedly eased credit too soon, and this was to accommodate high inflation expectations. But inevitably, inflation spiked as a result. Back then, each time the Fed thought inflation had peaked and cut rates to fight rising unemployment, inflation reignited like wildfire. It wasn't until 1979 to 1982 when Fed Chair Paul Volcker famously kept policy extremely tight despite a recession that inflation was finally crushed, and public inflation expectations re-anchored at low levels. Critics of the 2025 rate cuts invoke this lesson. Don't declare victory too early. They argue the Fed should hold a restrictive stance until inflation is convincingly back to 2%. In practical terms, restrictive means interest rates high enough to squeeze demand and put downward pressure on prices. Now, arguably, the downward pressure on prices could partially be resolved by eliminating these crazy tariffs, but that's a whole nother story. By contrast, an accommodative stance is when rates are set low to spur growth and prevent unemployment from rising. The worry is that the Fed, by trimming rates now, could flip back into accommodation while inflation is still above target, essentially hitting the gas when it should be tapping the brakes. Importantly, even at its pre-cut peak, 5.25%, the Fed's rate may not have been as tight as it looked once you account for inflation. A key concept here is the nominal versus real interest rate. The nominal rate is the stated rate, what the Fed sets, whereas the real interest rate is the nominal rate minus inflation. It's the real rate that influences the economy's heat because it reflects the true cost of borrowing after inflation. For example, with inflation around 3%, a 4% nominal interest rate is only about 1% in real terms. That is a modest restraint at best. The Dallas Fed president pointed out that despite a high-looking nominal rate, policy was likely only modestly restrictive, given persistent inflation and strong demand. In her analysis, aggregate demand, so consumer spending and business investment, remained resilient, and underlying inflation was broad-based, which meant the current rates weren't dramatically slowing the economy. Logan warned that there is relatively little room for additional rate cuts, without inadvertently moving to an inappropriately accommodative stance. In other words, a stance that could create higher inflation. In plainer terms, if the Fed cuts much more while inflation is still 3%, real rates could slip to zero or negative, effectively stimulating the economy again. That could fuel new price pressures, the last thing a central bank wants with inflation above target. Another crucial piece of critique involves inflation expectations. Expectations refer to what households and businesses anticipate inflation will be in the future. Though intangible, These expectations wield real power. If everyone expects, say, 3% inflation, prices and wages tend to rise about 3% as businesses and workers preemptively adjust. Expectations can thus become self-fulfilling. Fed skeptics worry that cutting rates now might send a signal that 2% inflation is no longer a hard line, causing the public to expect higher inflation ahead, which in turn would make higher inflation stick. In the 1970s, this dynamic led to a dreaded wage price spiral. Workers demanded bigger raises because they expected higher costs of living, and businesses facing higher wage bills hiked prices further. It became a vicious cycle. Once such expectations become unanchored, it's very difficult and painful to bring inflation back down. This is what happened with Volcker. Critics caution the Fed not to repeat this mistake. They argue that with core inflation still around 3% and signs of price acceleration in some sectors, the Fed should keep policy tight a while longer to demonstrate its commitment to 2% and firmly anchor expectation levels before they dig too deep into the unemployment problem. Premature easing, in their view, risks undermining the Fed's credibility on inflation fighting. As The Economist put it, America's monetary policy risks getting too loose. The central bank should remember that inflation at 2.6 to 3% and rising due to tariffs is still a problem that can't be ignored in the rush to support growth. Facing all of these concerns, Federal Reserve officials acknowledge the trade-off, but have laid out a clear rationale for their 2025 rate cuts. In their view, economic conditions warrant some easing, and they believe it can be done without letting inflation get out of control. Fed Chair Jerome Powell has been candid that there are no risk-free paths here. At this juncture, the Fed cannot simultaneously push inflation and unemployment to their desired levels overnight. It has to balance the risk. By late 2025, the risk of a sharp rise in unemployment became more urgent than the risk of lingering 3% inflation. Powell noted signs that the labor market had already cooled more than needed, with minority and young workers seeing a disproportionate level of unemployment. We don't need the job market to soften anymore, he said. This perspective reflects the Fed's dual mandate. Since downside risks to employment have risen, the Fed felt justified in providing a bit of support via rate cuts. Essentially, the Fed's rationale is that a modest cut, 0.25%, helps better balance the two goals, cushioning the job's downturn while still aiming to finish the job on inflation. The Dallas Fed's chair phrased it as preventing the labor market from slowing too much against the ongoing imperative of price stability. In practical terms, that means the initial rate cut in September was intended to backstop the labor market and prevent an unnecessary recession without abandoning the inflation fight. Moreover, Fed officials believe they have room to ease because the inflation outlook isn't as dire as it looks. A significant portion of the recent uptick in inflation is attributed to the new tariffs, which are seen as a one-time price level adjustment rather than a source of sustained inflation. In other words, once inflation rolls through with the new tariffs, it should stabilize itself. Standard economic theory, and the Fed's analysis, which is based on standard economic theory, suggests that an import tariff causes a one-off jump in the prices of goods, but it doesn't create ongoing inflation year after year. Fed researchers noted this and said that while tariffs did boost 2025 inflation, it hasn't triggered broader second-round effects in non-import prices so far. In fact, by September, the Fed had grown more comfortable that the tariff impact would be temporary, not the start of a 1970s-style chronic inflation. They expect price pressures from the tariffs to fade in 2026 once the shock passes. Now, the whole problem with this line of thinking is we once heard this thing about transitory inflation that was supposed to be temporary and it wasn't. So that leaves us to wonder if this will be the exact same sort of case. But supporting this view, many private forecasters also predict that inflation will peak toward the end of 2025 and then subside. And this does make sense, but keep in mind what happened with transitory inflation. For instance, economists surveyed by the Philadelphia Fed projected CPI inflation around 3% in Q4 of 2025, which is up from 2.9% in August, but then easing in 2026 as the tariff wave dissipates. And of course, this all relies on the fact that Trump stops raising tariffs for arbitrary reasons and settles the down, sorry, excuse my language there, when it comes to actually increasing tariffs on various different countries and using them as a weapon. Goldman Sachs likewise estimated core inflation would hit around roughly 3.2% at the end of the year. In short, the consensus is that the inflation bump is in fact going to be transitory, hopefully, a crucial assumption behind the Fed's willingness to trim rates now. But crucially, the Fed believes inflation expectations remain well anchored around 2%, which is a green light for cautious easing. Surveys and bond market indicators in 2025 show longer-term inflation expectations still close to the Fed's target, roughly in the 2 to 3% range despite the short-term blips. Powell and his colleagues have repeatedly emphasized that as long as the public's long-run inflation expectations don't ratchet up, the Fed can afford to respond more aggressively to growth and employment concerns. In his words, policymakers must keep our eye on inflation, but we cannot ignore maximum employment. The Fed's bet is that a slight rate cut now will not cause businesses and consumers to suddenly expect 5% inflation. If anything, seeing the Fed still talking tough on 2% may keep expectations anchored. Indeed, the Fed has been careful to communicate that it is strongly committed to returning to 2% inflation, even as it takes out insurance against a downturn. The official statements explicitly say further policy moves will be judged against incoming data on both inflation and inflation expectations. This transparency is intended to prevent any misperception that the Fed is easing up on its inflation battle. In essence, the Fed is telling markets, we're cutting rates a bit now, but don't worry, we haven't forgotten about inflation, and we will adjust if needed. Finally, the Fed can point to the fact that it is not acting entirely alone. Some other countries are cautiously cutting rates, despite above target inflation. They're doing this in an effort to engineer what is called a soft landing. For example, the Bank of Canada just recently reduced its rate to a 3-year low of 2.5%, citing a weak job market and receding underlying price pressures. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that the Bank of Canada doesn't have a dual mandate around inflation and employment in the same way that the Fed does. The Bank of Canada's only mandate is in fact inflation, but it's clear that they believe that supporting the economy and jobs is also part of their responsibility. Sweden's central bank also cut rates despite sticky core inflation, expressing confidence that those price pressures are temporary. These other cases from other countries suggest a broader judgment among central bankers that a moderate easing can be done without letting inflation get out of hand. And if it does in fact get out of hand, guess what? They'll just raise interest rates again, and it'll probably kill it pretty fast, just like it did the last time. The Federal Reserve's own staff and a majority of its policymakers share this outlook. In fact, projections released by the Fed officials in September signaled a couple more small rate cuts through the end of 2025, with inflation forecasted to gradually decline toward target over the next year. The Fed's internal models likely show that maintaining an overly high interest rate could needlessly hurt employment when inflation is already on a downward trajectory. By cutting rates just a bit, the Fed aims to support credit-sensitive sectors like housing and business loans and boost confidence, all while maintaining enough restraint to continue bending the inflation curve. It's a delicate calibration, to be sure. Powell acknowledged it's not incredibly obvious what to do in such a murky situation. Nonetheless, the Fed's base case is that this calibrated easing will lead to a soft landing, a scenario where the economy slows just enough to tame inflation without crashing into a deep recession. The U.S. Federal Reserve's decision to lower interest rates in 2025, despite above-target inflation, is a bold policy experiment born of necessity. It reflects a nuanced judgment call that the risk of an excessive downturn outweighed the risk of slightly higher inflation in the short term. The move is calm and analytical in tone, very much in line with the Fed's systems-focused approach. Weigh the data, consider the mandates, and adjust policy accordingly. The Fed is effectively attempting to thread the needle, providing just enough monetary accommodation to shore up a faltering job market, yet not so much as to unleash another inflationary spiral. This balancing act has drawn comparisons to past episodes like the 1970s and invites close comparisons to other central bank strategies today. The cause and effect logic behind the rate cuts is clear. Weaker hiring and fiscal tightening via tariffs posed a threat to growth, so easing aims to offset those headwinds, while confidence in inflation and anchored expectations provides the justification that policy can loosen a bit without losing grip on prices. Still, it is an experiment, and a scary one, and even the Fed admits there are no risk-free options. Should inflation prove stickier than anticipated, or should inflation expectations start drifting upward, the Fed may have to reverse course and hike aggressively, a scenario that everyone wants to avoid. Conversely, if the Fed had done nothing, the economy might have slid toward recession even faster, potentially causing a different kind of harm. In the end, the Fed's 2025 rate cuts underscore the reality that monetary policy is an exercise in probabilities and trade-offs, not moral judgments. The central bank is neither caving to political pressure nor cavalier about inflation. Rather, it is responding to a complex set of signals in an attempt to optimize outcomes. Whether this scariest rate experiment in history will be vindicated by a soft landing or reprimanded by resurgent inflation will become clear only with time. For now, the Fed is set off on this delicate path with eyes wide open, fully attentive to the risks on both sides of the economic equation, and ready to adjust the levers as needed. As such, 2025 will likely be remembered as a pivotal chapter, one where the Fed tested the limits of its dual mandate, calmly explaining its logic every step of the way and reminding the world that monetary policy is as much about art as it is about science.